My name's Chris Alderson. I'm the Chief Executive at Construction Health and Safety New Zealand Trust. So I'm sure most of you probably know who we are, but if you don't, we're the charitable trust looking to work with industry, government, the regulator to improve health, safety, wellbeing in the New Zealand construction industry. We are running a series of these webinars this year, and the sort of joining topic really is innovation. We know that we've been making some progress around healthier and safer workplaces in New Zealand, but we really need to think about some new ways of doing things, and we're really interested in some of the approaches that different organisations in the market are starting to employ. So last month, or around about 6 weeks ago, we talked about health and safety and design, and there'll be a series of other ongoing webinars throughout the year, bringing other interesting people to hear their thoughts as well. So a couple of housekeeping things. Throughout the webinar, you can now ask questions. We just ask if you use the chat function there, and we'll keep an eye on those. So there will be an opportunity to ask some questions. And the webinar will be available recorded on our website probably early next week. We just need a chance just to clean it up and edit it. So if you just give us a little bit of time to do that, that'll be great. So again, look, the topic today is one that's really interesting for me personally, and for CHASNZ and for the CHASNZ board, because it brings together a number of different interest areas. One of the things we've been thinking about for quite a long time is better ways of measuring health, safety and well-being. So moving away from lag indicators, obviously, to better measures of the drivers behind health and safety. It brings together some of the work we're thinking about around data analytics and predictive health and safety, which is really a new area of exploration for health and safety in the workplace. It's bringing together obviously some of the issues around psychosocial factors as well, and also ergonomics and sprains and strains and the relationship between them and those psychosocial factors within the workplace. So it ticks a lot of boxes. We have a couple of really interesting speakers today, so I'm going to hand over to them in a moment. So we have firstly Mike Steer, who is the co-founder of SaferMe. So SaferMe are a Kiwi company, really innovative, but working both in New Zealand, in the US and Australia. So we're lucky to have organisations in New Zealand like that pushing these boundaries. So Mike's been with the company, or started the company several years ago. I think he said to me he started it in Sweden when he was over there. So he's obviously got some experience in some really different environments as well. I think his current title is Chief Customer Officer. So it's a very outputs and customer facing organisation. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Steve Cantwell. So Steve did his PhD in applied cognitive psychology at the University of Waikato. And he's really the research project lead on this project. And of course, we need to thank ACC as well, because without ACC's support, these kind of investment in projects wouldn't happen. So this was originally part of a grant that was allocated to SaferMe to do some work in this area. And now it's time to start hearing about some of the results of that, or where they've got to so far, and where they're going next. So look, I'll quieten down now and hand over to Mike and Steve, and I'm sure they'll take you through some pretty interesting stuff in the next sort of 25 minutes to half an hour, and then we can get into some questions. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. No, it's really exciting to be here and to share, I guess, our work from the past 2 years with you all today. We're going to walk you through why we think this is really important. We're going to share some key lessons from our work with New Zealand construction businesses, particularly through last year. And we'll also share about an opportunity for businesses to get involved now in the next phase of our project as well, which is really exciting. And then, as Chris mentioned, we'll be happy to take some questions at the end of the session as well. So if you haven't heard of SaferMe before, so we've been around for nearly a decade now. We're a Wellington headquartered business, and our primary industry is serving safety management software for businesses. So we work with a number of construction and trade businesses, but a broad range of industries, really. Now, this journey for us really begins with ACC's Workplace Injury Prevention Program. And so ACC was looking to solve a challenge around an increase in musculoskeletal injuries. Actually, was the genesis of this project. So they'd seen a large increase in both the volume and the cost of those claims over the past decade. But they were quite prescriptive in their application process about the role of psychosocial factors. So recent research really ties quite strongly psychosocial factors with those poorer outcomes in terms of musculoskeletal injuries. So we teamed up with CHASNZ, with Civil Contractors NZ, and thankfully we were awarded the contract as well. And just before I dive further into it, I really do want to thank Chris and the team at CHASNZ. You play a magnificent role in the industry, driving forward some really important questions, supporting not just us, but a number of different organisations in the space as well. As you touched on, Chris, as well, ACC, can't thank them enough for their ongoing support through this project. It's been a wonderful opportunity to drive from really important research through to developing a product, and also to the team at Civil Contractors NZ. So to Alan, to Fraser and the team, thank you very much for your unwavering support through this process, and also to Peter Silcock, their former CEO, who was there when we first jumped on board with them. So what was really important for us as an organisation in tackling this challenge was to take a really science-based or evidence-based approach to solving this challenge. So the first thing that we did, or one of the first things we did, was to hire Dr. Campbell, who you're going to hear more from Steve on this call very shortly. And so Steve led this research piece, which was really quite foundational for the work that we've done since. And this was looking at what are the key risk factors which increase someone's likelihood of having an accident or injury at work. And what that did is it really helped us identify some key risk factors which we could see time and again in the data. There was really solid evidence to show that when these risk factors are present, we know that the risk of accident or injury goes up quite significantly. So that was a really important foundation for our work. Then getting from where we are there to some really solid research findings through to a product has been a really good process as well. So firstly, we extracted those risk factors, as I mentioned. We then sent those out to construction businesses in New Zealand to get feedback, to get validation. Are these factors that we've identified in the research things that actually resonate with you in your day-to-day work? Are these things that are genuinely impacting your business and your employees? With that information, we were then able to turn that basically into a long-form questionnaire, which we then went back out to other construction businesses and got that answered and got some really, really detailed and interesting data through that process. And that was through most of last year. That process we talk about as exploratory factor analysis. What that means is really understanding those risk factors in more detail. So understanding how they interrelate with one another, how they result in impacts like pain or self-reported incidents, and basically understanding how important each of these different factors are in the context of a construction business. With all of that information on board, we've then been able to take that and develop the tool that we've developed today. So it's been a really exciting development process, a lot of learning along the way. And we've also taken the usability lessons from that work with construction businesses into this as well, to understand how do we best deploy this so it can really work in the context of a construction firm. And so off the back of all that work, we've released what we call Safety Snap, which is our psychosocial risk manager product. Now, this is the idea of this is that it can help you to measure and to understand those key risk factors in your organization, to understand, are there things in your team which are at a concerning level? Is there something you need to draw your attention to and focus on? And this is stuff that's of interest, obviously, to safety, but also to HR and people functions and operational management as well. But I won't go into too much detail on the product right now. I'll come back and revisit how it works. But I want to step back and look at the factors that we actually assess and monitor and understand why they're really important. So we know from the research that when these risk factors that we measure are present, it increases the likelihood of accidents and injuries. So we know that there's really solid evidence to show that. Now, because a lot of these factors are psychosocial factors, and just to be 100% clear, we're talking about psychological and social factors that impact your workforce. So that's what the psychosocial comes from. We know because they are psychosocial factors that well-being problems is also something which results when these factors are present in your workspace as well. So those two, very solid evidence showing the connection between these factors being present and these poorer outcomes. Now, with these other three, so we've got absenteeism, we've got productivity issues, and we've got worker retention. And what's been really interesting through this process for us is understanding that both from other strands of research, but also from working with clients and prospects through this process and through the research, that these other factors actually tie really strongly to the risk factors that we measure as well, or so I should say, these outcomes. So when we, I guess, zoom out and look at this set of factors that we're helping businesses to monitor, we can see that it's really quite a pivotal set of factors to understand. It's influencing some very important things in terms of how your people are, how you manage your people, and obviously the overall performance of the business. So it's been a very insightful and huge learning process for all of us, and we've identified some really interesting factors from that. So to give you a quick overview of the factors themselves, so there's 15 of them that we monitor in the tool. There'll be some that are quite obvious there, I'm sure. Stress, fatigue, for example. Maybe some slightly more obscure around work clarity or peer relationships. But essentially, we know that all of these factors have a significant bearing on someone's overall risk of not just accident injuries, well-being issues, but also absenteeism and churning or worker retention issues. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the work we did last year. So this was some detailed work with construction businesses in New Zealand, from which we've generated a lot of data. And so I'm going to take you through the first lesson, and then I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to walk you through some interesting insights from the data itself. Now, the first point here is about engagement. So I'm sure an interesting question to many of you on the call: how do we drive better engagement with our teams? And so we certainly learned a lot here. We tried really hard and we failed. First of all, we tried some more, we failed some more. In the end, we got out on sites, we observed workers, we had really detailed discussions, and we designed a process which we see can work. We made some really important tweaks to make sure that this is something that can work in conjunction with the construction business operations. And so the first lesson from that, I guess, is how important it is to, whatever you do, to work with and not against the patterns of how people function. We saw, I mean, practically speaking, for us, that meant that we designed this in conjunction with either your pre-start or toolbox talk sessions. So we saw that by doing that, we can make it a whole lot easier for people to participate. We're not adding something new to their day. We know these sessions already happen. We know that people attend them. And then we've made it short and simple enough that people can do it during those sessions without making those sessions become very long. And that ties into the second point, which is time. Obviously, we have to try and think about brevity as much as we can in whatever we're looking to achieve. So for us, there is a fair bit of detailed data we want to collect, but rather than trying to get that all at once, we've designed the system so we do it in small snap bits each single day. So we keep it short, we keep it snappy. What that means practically is that if you do this on a daily basis, it only takes your workers 10 seconds a day to do it. If you do it on a weekly basis with a toolbox session, it takes less than a minute. So again, keeping it short and snappy, really important. Language is also a very critical one, we noticed. So keeping it simple in terms of, firstly, the language we use to ask questions, but also making it very simple to answer those questions. So answering the questions occurs on either a 5-point scale or on a yes/no basis. So it's really easy for us to get structured data. I mean, when we look at the construction workforce overall, and this applies to other industries also, by and large, I mean, this is not a group of people where we're going to get great success if we try to get them to pick up a wellbeing app and enter their thoughts and feelings at the end of the day for 10 or 15 minutes. That's going to be a real uphill struggle. So we've designed this quite deliberately so we can make it simple, make it short, make it easy, and get that structured data we need to understand what's going on. The final part of language, which is also really important and a really key lesson for us, particularly from our visits to sites last year, and that was just the sheer number of workers who don't have English as a native tongue. As a response to that, we've made it so that the system can be translated into whatever language you need it to be for your workforce, because it's really key that we get all parts of your workforce participating with this so we understand the full picture of what's going on. And finally, anonymity. It really does matter. We saw potentially different answer patterns, but certainly a barrier to engagement where people feel like they could be identified. Could this come back to me? So we've removed that barrier. And instead of looking at that individually, we look at a cross-sectional approach to what are the issues that are affecting your organization, and then how can we go about addressing them. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Steve to walk you through the next points.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a really encouraging, and it's wonderful to be able to share some of the findings we've had from our research. It's a genuine pleasure. The first thing is we had a really great, really fantastic response to the survey that we put out to the industry with over 200 respondents, which is wonderful. The research really clearly shows that construction produces some of the most stressful jobs, and that's for a number of reasons. There's long hours, there's physically demanding work, high workloads, there's a lot of time pressures, times to complete things, as well as concerns, especially now regarding employment, and that's a particular issue for labourers. So we know that stress is really important, and it clearly plays a really significant role. And it arises when people feel like they're unable to cope with the demands that are placed upon them. The literature really showed that stress is one of the key factors that predicts both increased accident likelihood and the time taken to recover from an accident or injury. And is a really useful factor to measure as well. It acts as a kind of umbrella measure that allows us to look at and potentially capture some of those factors that are present in the workplace that are harder to monitor, harder to observe, and a little bit more nuanced. So stress is kind of a really good overall measure to be using. The items that we used to measure stress fell into basically three dimensions. There was a physical or physiological dimension to stress, as well as a cognitive or mental dimension to stress, and an emotional dimension to stress. And this fits really well with the literature. So that's a really encouraging finding that our exploratory factor analysis demonstrated that these factors correspond really well to what we would expect from studies of these factors. Workers and managers reported basically the same levels of stress and reported kind of a low to moderate level. So very similar responses there, though workers had a slightly higher variability, which suggests that some workers are on the kind of low end of stress, whereas some are on the much higher end of stress. However, if you rank order the distribution of stress and look at the tail ends, you can see that those with high levels of stress were also found to have really low job satisfaction, low job security. They perceived the work community as less supportive and had low peer support. Those with high levels of stress also reported greater levels of physical and mental fatigue, lower levels of control or decision autonomy, and reported workloads that were at a higher pace and rate. So that's a really, really important finding, that stress, plays this really important role in how your workers respond and how they're doing. We didn't have a large number of accidents or incidents in the time that we were taking the survey. So not a lot of people reported having an accident in the 3 months that we were collecting data. Although we did have a really good response in terms of musculoskeletal pain. So not necessarily saying that people are having a lot of musculoskeletal pain, but that there was a reasonable range of responses there. And we found that stress actually corresponds really nicely to musculoskeletal pain. So shoulder, neck, back, and joint and muscle pain. We found that those who have higher levels of stress also reported higher levels of pain. And that's a really important finding. Though we can't infer causality with that, of course, and it may be the case that those who have higher pain also report higher levels of stress. So we don't know the direction of that relationship. So we're looking forward to having additional data that will help us discern more about the nature of the relationship between stress, accidents, pains, and risk. And this is something that we're really looking forward to as we collect more data with this new iteration of the product. We found that the psychosocial factors that we measure, like peer support, job satisfaction, role clarity, had a moderating effect on the relationship between stress and pain. So what that is to say is you can think of it kind of like a seesaw. If you have a seesaw and you have a fulcrum in the middle, if you drop on one side, you're going to get an increase on the other. But if you move that fulcrum, a small increase on one end can result in a massive increase on the other end. And that's it's an imperfect analogy, but that's a way of thinking how these psychosocial factors impact that relationship. We found things like job control, social support, support from supervisors operate as a kind of moderating or buffering variable in that relationship between stress and the stresses and workplace well-being. So it seems that as you add job satisfaction, social support, the effect of stress becomes less on the effects of pain and potentially accident outcomes as well. So overall, it was observed that factors with a negative influence on workplace well-being were also at a low to moderate level in our analysis. And this indicates a degree of relative health in our sample. And so it's a really encouraging finding to see that these psychosocial factors have a moderating effect. The third thing I'd like to point out is that peer support was found to be a really powerful driver of job satisfaction and was related to lower levels of workplace stress. For instance, self-reported support from peer and supervisors was found to be related to greater job satisfaction. The measure of job satisfaction may lie in a sort of central nexus of factors, and this appears to be what we found. So job satisfaction was the most correlated factor we identified, being related to peer support, control or job autonomy, work demands, job security, and it had an inverse or negative relationship with things like fatigue, impulsivity, and stress. If you rank order job satisfaction scores and look at the tail ends of those distributions, participants who reported low job satisfaction were also found to have highly significant but low support from peers and supervisors. And there seems to be some support to this, as increased job satisfaction appears to moderate the relationship between fatigue and stress, for instance. So the effects of satisfaction with colleagues was found to be negatively correlated with both cognitive and emotional stress. So as the construction industry is really renowned and has a really strong reputation for workplace camaraderie, it might be something that we should focus on, looking at social inclusiveness and peer support, encouraging that workplace culture as a powerful resource that we can add to our toolkit to certainly develop and encourage. And the last thing I'd like to point out is that when we looked at our sample, our demographics, and we broke them down into our frontline workers, foremen, managers or executives in the industry, as well as health and safety professionals, we found that health and safety professionals had the lowest reported levels of the highest levels of workplace demands, high workplace bullying, the lowest level of support from superiors as well. They also reported the lowest levels of job satisfaction, role clarity, and it seemed like they feel disconnected from the workplace culture. And this was a really difficult finding to see that health and safety professionals had such a kind of negative view of what was happening. And this is kind of discouraging in some ways, considering the importance of the role that we all play. So I think following from that finding, certainly check in with your colleagues and co-workers and see how they're doing. I think it's hard if you're working alone or potentially working in a small team, to see sort of the bigger picture, and certainly check in with one another, check in with other teams and see how they're doing. Consider defining success with additional measures, such as a flourishing workforce. So rather than focusing on those traditionally lagging indicators such as accident frequency, which is a poor indicator in some ways, because we're wanting them to be infrequent. We're wanting accidents to be infrequent. Instead, focusing on things like, are our teams satisfied in their roles? Do they have clear expectations? What's job satisfaction like? What's the workplace culture like? I think those are better indicators of how we're doing as health and safety professionals. And that leads into certainly considering how we can work strategically to improve work conditions for our people. I think that would be a really good thing to be focusing on. So with that, I'll hand back to Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I'll quickly recap those points, because I think there's some really important points out of what Steve has shared there. So firstly, stress, as you saw, is a really serious indicator for poor accident, wellbeing and performance outcomes. So it is a really important measure to be monitoring and understanding over time is what is happening to stress in your organization, how are people being affected by it. Secondly, the effects of that stress can actually be mitigated. So utilizing tools like peer and manager support by providing greater work clarity, and also really focusing on improving job satisfaction, we can reduce and, as Steve said, buffer against the impact that stress has, which is a really important tool to have. On the flip side of that, the third point is that we need to be aware of some of these red flags of high or uneven workloads, fatigue, of course, and poor workplace relationships can all compound the issue of stress and really put people in a high risk zone. So watching out for those things is key. Job satisfaction, that is a really useful measure. If you're looking for one thing you want to track in your organization, we'd probably say that job satisfaction would be a great place to start. It is strongly interrelated and connected to many of the other factors that we look at. And it's a very good barometer of where the team's at and what relative risk they face. And then finally, as Steve just mentioned, looking out for yourself and fellow health and safety professionals. That was one of the, I guess, strongest findings that we found in the research, and it clearly points that this is a challenging role, a challenging position, and so we encourage you to take support and make everything you can to make that role even stronger and better. So next, what's happening now for SaferMe with our tool and the project, and what's coming next? So as I mentioned before, we've released our tool. It's now in the hands of the first clients who launched with it already last month. And it's really exciting to see everyone going through that process and how it's working. So reminding you, so the objective of our tool was to help you to measure, to understand what are the risk factors in our organization, which are at a concerning level, and which ones are at an okay level. So where can we focus our energy, in other words, on resolving issues that might be existing in the organization. And that's really important for many reasons. But what's really important about measuring in conjunction with whatever you do is that if we're measuring before, measuring during, and then measuring after any different changes or things you might implement, so a wellbeing program, for example, or any new measures you implement to your team to try to improve conditions, we want to understand the impact of those changes. If we're not measuring before and not measuring afterwards, there's no way we can really do that. So it can be really challenging to understand what's happened with the investment that you're throwing into that if you don't do that measuring before and after. The process itself, super simple. Basically, whoever's leading your pre-start or your toolbox talk presses a button on their device that generates a QR code. The team can scan it, answer their 2 or 3 questions for the day. As I said, it takes 10 seconds a day if they're doing it daily. And then that data feeds through to your dashboard, where generally HR and people function, your safety function, and operational management will all have access to understand what's going on. It can be answered in different ways as well. If everyone doesn't have a device, easy to share devices and answer on the same device, no problems there. So what is next for us? So right now we're filling up our next 2 cohorts on this pilot with the new tool. This is the only plug you'll hear me give today, but there is one plug, and that is that if you are interested in your team and looking at addressing wellbeing issues, if you're looking to get more into the root causes of accidents and injuries, or issues such as absenteeism or worker turnover is concerning, it'd be really interesting to have a conversation. So you can see my email address there on screen, mike@safer.me. Feel free to reach out personally. I would love to have a discussion with you and chat about it further and see if it could be a good fit for your team. So with that, we will jump across to some questions from everyone.
Hey, thanks, Mike and Steve. Yeah, really interesting. Firstly, just apologies for those out there who sort of heard a few glitches in that. Unavoidable, I think, but we'll try and do better next time. Just a couple of things that really resonated with me. I really liked the analogy around the seesaw. That was quite interesting in terms of actually moving the fulcrum, about those protective factors and about, the deadening effect it might have on, you might not be able to solve everybody's stress, but if you've actually got protective factors within the workplace, there's certainly a restorative place. And quite often, the workplace can be where people get away from some of their stresses as well, which come from outside of work. So I think that's a really valuable lesson. I think that the other thing was you mentioned, the fact that, the construction industry is known for a lot of camaraderie, which I think we'd all agree with. And that's interesting because not often do we think about focusing on the positive things. We're all sort of into, let's fix everything that's wrong without actually saying, why don't we double down on some of the things that actually are really right? And that might be an easier path to take. So I think that's really quite insightful as well, which I hadn't quite thought about so much. And I guess lastly, and I saw it come up on the chat quite a bit, the sobering numbers around health and safety professionals as well being, feeling unsupported. I think that's something you'd probably find in a lot of industries, not just construction. And it's something that, perhaps we can go back to CHASNZ and some of the other places that might be able to help in that area. So some really interesting insights there that we kind of haven't seen before, to my knowledge. So look, there is a couple of questions that have come through. There was one in the beginning there just on scope there. People were curious about, the 250 workers. What part of the industry did they come from? I know you were dealing with civil contractors, so were they all civil contracting tradies, or were they wider than that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the workers that we had that participated, to the best of my knowledge, came from several civil construction companies. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. So yeah, we approached a number of companies to participate, and we got a really good response from them, and their workforce were the ones who participated in the study, as well as their health and safety guys and their management. We opened it up at the later stages. So initially we were focusing specifically on participating companies. Then we opened it up a bit later on, and the survey was more broadly distributed through several networks to try and tap into that understanding, kind of that perspective from management and health and safety as well. So that's exactly our sample demographic.
Yeah. So a mixture of civil and commercial were the biggest. And then, we had a few smaller and different size companies mixed in with that as well.
So obviously looking forward, it would be good to get a bit more diversity from other parts of the industry in there as well.
Yeah,
what we might find, it might just show exactly the same thing, but
it's a good point, Chris, and it's, I guess, like, to be really straight up about the way we see this is that this is not like the end point. This is very much like, now we're in a phase where the more and more data we collect, the stronger and stronger the system and the understanding becomes. So then we can start feeding back even more certainty, information to industry about the patterns we're seeing, the trends we're seeing across different branches.
Great. Another question here, might be a bit of a technical question, and you might be able to answer it. If not, we can think about it later. But I just had a question about what was the definition used for factors. Might be a question for you, Steve.
That's a good question. So my perspective on what a factor is you ask a whole bunch of questions related, generally speaking, to these things that were identified. So stress, fatigue, job satisfaction, peer support, those kinds of things. You ask all these questions, and then you perform an analysis that clusters those around certain things. and you end up with a bunch of questions related or to a particular variable, and those variables correspond really nicely to the definitions of things like stress, fatigue, and so on. So generally speaking, we took the literature, we identified factors in that. This is going to become really circular really quickly, but we identified factors in the literature like stress, and then we asked questions that were related to that, and then we saw how they clustered, and then we sort of refined that. So maybe I can reply to that better in the when we write out some answers, when we
yeah. Well, I think the other thing is as well, like they've got Mike, they've got your email address, so if people are really curious about that, I'm sure they can contact you directly, and you can get down right down to detail.
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. So generally they're kind of more themes than anything else, but we approached it once we'd done the survey in a more statistical fashion.
Cool. Getting lots of good questions here. Might the fear of prosecution under HASWA be affecting perceptions, adding stress to those with health and safety obligations, like workers, or I guess officers or health and safety people? So did you see any of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point about, you know, what impact that might be having on that group. I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess that would be something that may only increase over time, certainly if we see some sort of psychosocial legislation in the same way that Australia has recently legislated. So, yeah, I don't know, Steve, do you have anything to add that around the results that we gained?
I'm just rereading the question. I think it's certainly quite a real possibility with increased obligations, with increased responsibility based on the Act coming out more recently. So it's hard to know how that comes out in the data. I think that's something that really would need to be addressed through a more qualitative approach. Though certainly, if we look to the data in long term and we collect data over time, we might be able to observe some patterns, and we could potentially tie that back to changes in obligations and responsibilities. Though it's quite tricky. So I think that's something that would have to be addressed more through a qualitative approach. That's a really good question, and I'd love to dig into it a bit more. So thank you for that. It's a good question.
The researcher in you. This one I know is probably slightly outside your scope as well, because I know you were very focused on work-based factors, but you might have some insight into other psychosocial factors outside of work that people are suffering from. Did you get any of that coming through?
Yeah, I'll jump in there first, Steve. We did actually chat about this just the other day, didn't we? So a lot of the things in the way we ask and monitor them is a little non-specific to work. So there's the root of that factor, the genesis of that factor could actually come from outside work. What we're looking to understand is the degree of it and how it's impacting them in the workspace. Because you're absolutely right, the person asking that question there, that that those factors are also having an influence on who turns up at work and how they're cognitively impacted by these different psychosocial factors.
I think it would be fair to say, though, from your study, to say, like, no matter where the psychosocial factors come from, those protective factors that you mentioned around, good job satisfaction, work clarity, and peer support, help no matter where those risk factors have come from, right? Yeah. We might not be able to control where all those factors are coming in from, but we probably have a lot more control over some, let's call them the broad spectrum antibiotics that we can put into our business. In some ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's right. And again, I mentioned it before, but measuring and quantifying that is really the best way to understand what's happening. And then if you do implement some of those, put some emphasis around some of those positive factors, what is the impact of that change? So you can actually measure and understand and inform the organization about the impact you've had.
I'm going to bunch the next two questions together. I think they're more around the product. How there's just a question about how the data is represented, I guess, or do you have a sample of that? Maybe you can't show that now, but maybe we could include that in the documents later on. And how long does it take between actually doing the survey and getting a result? What's the sort of timeline?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, so the data is essentially represented in real time on your dashboard, right? So we can look at each different factor and then drill down into the individual factors. So say we're looking at fatigue, understand what sort of rating that is at in your organization. You can look at that at both an organization level, but then break that down. So you might have different sites you want to view that by, or different business units, different shifts, however you split that down. So you can get really quite granular about how you want to view and understand, if there is an issue with a particular factor, where is that an issue, and what groups is that a particular issue, so you can really get to the source and help to identify and cover it. In terms of how it's accessed, so your team, whoever you want on the administrative side of your team to have access, you have access to that, like I say, pretty much in real time. So there's no lag between that data going in and you understanding it. What we do with the questions is we're monitoring 15 factors. We rotate through those factors over the course of a cycle. So basically every 2 to 3 weeks, you have fresh data around all of those different risk factors.
Yeah. There's a really good, I think this is for someone's already thinking about the use of where you might be going here. But is there a way to utilize the data on health and wellbeing to analyze more positive construction methods? Example, cross-laminated timber versus concrete and steel. Construction is known for safer, quieter, healthy work. Could be interesting for this information to feed back into the design process for the broader industry. So I think someone's thinking about where you're going next, potentially.
100%. Yeah, I love that question. I can see, Steve, you're nodding as well. So definitely, as we gain more and more data, we get more certainty around these factors, then we start matching that to the outcomes, if you like, within organizations and different processes, and understanding where and why are these differences occurring. But it is only through, of course, generating more and more data that we can have that level of detail and certainty around that information. So yeah, really interesting. Got time for 1 or 2 more. Just a question around hearing, and whether hearing came through as a factor, someone said it's just being generally inadequately addressed, and causing stress on workers. It's usually only, and the use of hearing protection is often a violation. So did you get any of the sort of more physical, environmental things coming through?
Yeah. So we did ask questions related to, and I think it came under the general umbrella of demands is related to things like related to hearing. So do you work in an environment where there's significant noise, or you have to pay attention to machinery or people, things that generate noise, and I don't think we found anything significant. So just because we didn't find anything significant doesn't mean there's something that isn't significant there. It just means our data we don't have enough data to discern that. It's a really good question, and it's something that perhaps I'll have a little bit more of a look into in the data around that. It's a good question.
Fantastic. Look, guys, I think we'll have to wrap the questions up there. I know there's some we haven't answered, but what we will do is provide answers to all those questions. And if you want to ask questions after the webinar is closed, info@chaznz.org. We're always contactable on that. Look, I'd just like to thank both Mike and Steve today, for your time and being so open about, the work that you're doing. And it's often also, quite risky from your perspective when you're mid-flight through a project, to come out and open the kimono to a certain perspective and show people what you've been up to. But, we really respect that, because, that's the way we all learn. And I think you've raised a lot of questions in people's minds, which you'll be thinking about. And hey, well, look, we don't have all the answers. So, firstly, look, thanks a lot, guys. And I'll leave you to sign off in a minute. But just before we go, just saying to everyone, we have a number of other webinars coming up in the coming months, which you'll hear about. We have some good international content coming in as well, so we really look forward to bringing that as well. Thanks from CHASNZ's point of view for everybody who's online today, and thanks again to ACC and CCNZ, and I'll give the last word to Mike and Steve.
I really appreciate all of you for coming to listen, coming to hopefully learn something that'll be useful. So we covered 2 factors today. Basically, we looked at stress and job satisfaction as one, which is a negative indicator of outcomes in the workplace, and one that can be a really positive indicator in the workplace. And I would encourage you to look at ways you can potentially be measuring these things in your workplace, and certainly to encourage the things that increase job satisfaction, increase you know, the satisfaction amongst your workers, and also focusing, you know, potentially on the things that can decrease stress, or the ways that we can encourage our workers to be more open about dealing, if they're dealing with stress, then potentially supporting them, encouraging, creating an environment that encourages them. So yeah, I want to bring that to you, and hopefully that's something that you can find useful. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve, and yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Been a real pleasure to share this work. There has been some sweat over the last couple of years. Again, thank you to the support of CHASNZ, Civil Contractors NZ, and ACC. And as we said before, you know, we're really excited to work with more and more partners, because the more and more data we get through the system, we get more and more learnings, and we can share that with industry, and take that aggregated view and look at what's happening, and help to solve problems together. So thank you, and hope to hear from some of you after the call.